Hello, everyone. I'm Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for Texas Exes, and thank you for joining us for our April lunchtime lecture. And thanks to our sponsor, Home Chef, for making this event possible. Our speaker today is here to help us increase our well-being. Dr. Jacqueline Evans earned a BA in psychology from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 2003, and her PhD in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin in 2011. Her research interests are centered on the social psychophysiology of stress, and she is especially interested in influences of personality, social, neuroendocrine, and genetic factors on cortisol hormone response to and recovery from acute stress, and further downstream, the implications for health. She's here today to share lessons psychological research reveals about how emotions and stress unfold. She will also consider practices grounded in science to support well-being and thriving in the face of adversity, with opportunities for you to engage in reflection and guided activities. We really want to welcome Dr. Evans.
Thank you so much for having me today. It is an absolute joy and an honor to be with you. As you talked about, we'll be spending some time taking some lessons from across different disciplines in psychology to really kind of expand our well-being toolkit. And so I'm excited to share as much as I can with you today about that and to guide you in some practices that you can start trying today that I hope will add to the meaningfulness of your life. So just a brief introduction about me. I am a product of UT. I'm a happy alum, but I also wanted to share that, through my teaching interests being related to my research interests in stress and physiology, it's really led me to teaching a lot of undergraduate and graduate courses on emotions, stress, health psychology, well-being. And I've learned a lot in the process about best practices, not just about teaching and learning, but also about well-being. And I'm excited to share those. That's also led me to do a bit of service, and I'm very student focused. So I just wanted to give a shout out to all of our liberal arts students and all of the amazing partners that we have that drive their success through advising and professional development, and all of our dedicated faculty. So today we'll talk a little bit about first, what is an emotion really, and how does that relate to what stress is? And we'll unpack that, and I'll share a little bit of history that extends outside of psychology to kind of set the table for us. And then I'd like to turn our attention to thinking about coping with stress as well as regulating our emotions. And we'll do some practices that I hope will deepen our well-being based on the empirically supported and grounded principles about well-being. And as we wrap up, we'll think about how what we've learned today supports developing a toolkit, right? And everyone should have their own idiosyncratic, unique toolkit for their version of coping with stress and regulating their emotions. But some practices work better than others. So hopefully we can talk about how to add those most impactful practices. So the very first thing we're going to start with today is a bit of a homework assignment for you for right now. I have to be a teacher. I'm in teacher mode. So we're going to do a brief activity. I would love to invite you to just reflect on 3 little things that you feel gratitude for in this moment. It can be anything. So it can be across your, life. It could be important people in your life, relationships that feel especially important to you that you want to express your gratitude for. Or it could be something simple like having clean water to drink. Living in Austin, we know that that's not always something that has been freely and accessibly available to us. So it's a really great time to just drill down on anything from the mundane to the hugely important. So go ahead and take a moment and think of 3 little things that you feel gratitude for in this moment and jot them down. We'll return to this at the end. I'm going to make my list right now. All right. So hopefully everyone had a chance to make their list in no particular order. I think I'm feeling especially grateful for sleep. my dog and my daughter's health after she bounced back from a cold. Not sure what your list is like, but it can be anything. Just honing in on those mindful moments of gratitude are really powerful, and we'll return to explaining why. So now let's turn our attention to some of the most important topics that we've covered in psychology for pretty much our entire existence as a discipline, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's think about what actually is an emotion. We talk about them and think about them all the time. They're brief and momentary reactions. And unlike a feeling of a mood or unlike a personality trait, these are things that require some kind of eliciting event. They don't just, manifest, right? There's a reaction to something in our environments or in our worlds. We often think about them as having really strong valence. So maybe they're really positive or really negative sensations, but they could also be kind of neutral, maybe not as intense and not as strongly positive or negative. Importantly, emotions direct us towards goals that matter to us. So when something really great is offered to us and we feel really joyful about that, that directs us to approach it, that drives us and motivates us towards whatever that goal is. It helps us bond with people. I'll never forget the first time that my daughter smiled at me when she was 6 weeks old, and how profoundly her joy made me, well, melt, but also motivate me to get through those tough early infant days in caring for her. So we're very motivated, and it supports our ability to bond with each other. There are also profound negative emotions that help direct us in meaningful ways. And so I think it's important to pause and just note that emotions aren't just those subjective feeling experiences we're all too familiar with. They also include really important physiological changes and big behaviors, or maybe subtle behaviors that are visible outside of our body. So maybe it's a facial expression, or maybe it's an action, but the physiology is driving us to do these important behaviors. So when we think about it together, emotions are a multi-component response that relies on all three of these features, meaning that it goes much more than just that kind of subjective, fleeting, momentary feeling that we have. Emotions are bodily sensations as well. So thinking about the history of emotions, I think, is really fascinating. We're, as psychologists, not the first ones to tap into these ideas. Going back to Aristotle in the 4th century BC, he wrote about the moderation principle and argued for this idea that, counter to Plato, he believed that judgment was actually improved by moderate emotion, that emotion wasn't the enemy of reason, and that some level of emotion helped direct us towards better reasoning, better judgment. He also argued that emotions can actually depend on the cognitions and thoughts and judgments that we have. This will come back to be really important for us later. And shockingly, not a new idea, right? We'll spend some time thinking about what psychology has done with that idea. Fast forwarding in our time machine a bit, going ahead to Descartes in the 17th century, Descartes talked about the taxonomy of the passions, and he argued for a set of emotion-like characteristics that he called the passions. And he said that they were really important in directing our actions, that these were, not this byproduct, but rather some really important driving force in our lives. He also said that thoughts can help us regulate our emotions, that by changing our thinking, our emotions would change too. So on both counts, spoiler alert, they were both very right. Fast forwarding again to Charles Darwin, in 1872, he actually published The Expressions of Man and Animals, where he cataloged different facial expressions in humans as well as in non-human animals. And he really sought to demonstrate that these were not irrational, reactions that we needed to overcome, but rather they were highly adaptive, highly functional, and necessary for survival. In fact, he argued that they evolved as the vestiges of, our animal ancestor past, and that they provided a survival advantage for us, and that is why they existed. So he argued that emotions helped us through natural selection and sexual selection. When you think about what natural selection and emotions would say, being afraid of something that can kill you is definitely something that helps you get away from whatever that thing is. So being able to, outrun a predator or get away from a noxious stimulus is something that would have been a distinct competitive advantage, and help us survive. This is a very different way of thinking about emotions than many of us were socialized to think. No fault to my parents whatsoever, but I don't think I really grew up thinking that emotions were serving me, that they were, an advantage that was helping me adapt to my environment. So I think that's also something that, speaking as, an instructor of undergraduate students, so helpful to think about what are my emotions doing for me and how are they serving me in an adaptive way. So now kind of bridging that gap and getting us to the birth of psychology, in 1879, we see the first psychology laboratory pop up in Leipzig, Germany. And from that point forward, psychology grew pretty rapidly. In America, right away, we see William James, one of the preeminent American psychologists in the 1880s, talking about emotions immediately. This was an immediate interest in American psychology. But what's different and sets a psychologist's perspective apart from the earlier discussions about emotion was the application of the scientific method of deriving experimental paradigms and thinking about the connection between the brain and emotions and the environment that someone is in and how it affects and also relates to their emotions. So today, researchers across psychological disciplines, from developmental psychologists, neuroscientists, social psychologists, clinicians, all are interested in affect or emotions. And in fact, there's, quite a lot of discussion and heated debate about a variety of topics, including, should we think about emotions as these basic or discrete feeling states, like fear? So should we use the word fear to describe the emotion? Or is it more helpful to think about fear in terms of the dimensions of arousal and valence? So the image I have here on the screen is showing you what that might look like. You could think about the emotion of joy as being, a medium arousal, positive experience, and the emotion of fear as being a high arousal, negative valence experience. So it allows psychologists to think a little bit deeper about what these discrete feeling states might actually resemble in terms of that bigger construct of what an emotion is to the body and to behavior. That brings us to, in our time machine, one more step forward to the 1960s, which presented psychology with a reckoning. For many, many decades, about 50 years, psychologists really focused on a behaviorist approach where they thought about just outward visible behavior and really tried to focus on making an objective, measurable science, which served psychology well, but it also meant that we lost our mind a little bit. And when we say that, what we mean is that we just kind of tried to ignore thinking because it was inconvenient. It's not easily visible. But there began to be a really major shift, especially in light of, the birth of computing, that changed the way that psychologists approached thinking about thinking. So we were able to regain our minds again. And part of that is evidenced by the just absolute, boom of cognitive psychology in that time, and then in the 90s and beyond, neuroscience. And we think about Richard Lazarus, he had a major impact on helping us understand emotions and stress by regaining our mind and thinking about when we see some stimulus, like some big hairy spider in this case, we're going to make a cognitive appraisal about that thing. We're not just going to immediately have, some kind of feeling state. First, we make a judgment about it. So Let's say you love spiders, you're going to have a very different reaction when you see that. You're going to say, oh, it's fuzzy and cute. I love it. And then that's going to lead to a very different emotional reaction than I will have when I see that spider and say, oh my goodness, I really don't like spiders. Is that thing poisonous? And the naturally, following emotional reaction I'll have is going to be a feeling state of fear, behavior that drives me to move away and, get some distance between me and my furry friend here. And then physiological arousal that's driving and is the mechanism behind that behavior. So emotion is serving this really important adaptive purpose for me to get away from this guy. But first and importantly, appraising that stimulus in relation to my goals, maybe of survival, and helping drive those bodily and behavioral changes that I need are really important. So Lazarus helped us kind of put cognition in the center of that process. So that's why it's called the cognitive mediational model, because cognition or thinking, the judgment that we make, is at the center of that process. And then after that, it necessitates whatever kind of emotion follows from that cognitive appraisal. We think about cognitive appraisal, it's a jargon term, but it basically just means, how we think about or how we view that stimulus. So drilling down on that idea a little more, I want to share a quote from Lazarus that gets at this idea of appraising stress. Stress arises when individuals perceive that they cannot adequately cope with the demands being made on them or with threats to their well-being. And I think, it's important to highlight that it's a perception of our capacity to cope with something based on our appraisal of what that event is. So we're making a judgment about whatever is around us that is happening with our thinking that then impacts what follows, be it an emotion or a stress response. So I want to encourage us to think about what actually is the stress response. What is stress? I feel humbled that the person who coined the term stress, Hans Selye, had a delicious quote. Everyone knows what stress is, but nobody really knows. Oh, good. I feel better. I've spent a lot of time thinking about stress, and this still resonates with me. So I want to turn this over to you for a moment and ask you to pull out your gratitude reflection note there. And now let's add another piece of the puzzle. What is stress to you? What does it mean to be stressed? And I think an important follow-up question is, what's your take on this? Do you think stress can actually be a good thing? So take a moment, and I'll just pause here for a few, maybe 30 seconds or so. I'd love to have you jot down your initial take, and then we'll kind of keep track and see if that evolves over today. All right, so hopefully you've decided where you stand on this. When we think about, what stress is to us, it depends on who we are and the situations we're in and our relationship to those things. And when we think about being stressed, I think we got to go back to the idea of what our capacity or our resources are, and that's something we're going to come back to again and again. But can stress be good? That seems like a really tough question to ask ourselves. So we'll unpack that over the next couple topics here, and we'll see if we can move our ideas about that. Robert Sapolsky is someone who has been legendary in helping, scientists as well as, just a general audience learn about how stress moves and drives us. He wrote a really beautiful book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's thought-provoking, and it helps us understand that humans have this incredible ability to have imagined stress. We can put ourselves in stressful situations just by thinking about the prospect of them. We can imagine being overwhelmed, and that can lead to the same stress response that a zebra would have as it's trying to outrun a lion. And so thinking about what even is a stress response, it's that fight or flight response you learned about all those years ago in school. And the goal of it is to necessitate our survival. So this fits really well with, the same ideas that Darwin was talking about with our emotions, that the goal is to respond to the moment for that survival advantage, but then to recover, right? To return to some kind of homeostatic balance. So our sympathetic nervous system is sympathetic to our plight, and it activates to support our immediate short-term survival. On the flip side, our parasympathetic nervous system can't also be running full speed at the same time. So our resources are diverted to those urgent needs. And when that threat has passed, when that lion is out of sight for those zebras, they're able to go back to digestion and growth and reproduction and all those activities that you really don't want to spend precious resources on now until you know that there will be a later, right? If the future is uncertain, maybe don't worry about reproduction just yet. So it's important to note that all of the science tells us that the stress response itself is not problematic, that, responding to stress or feeling stress is not a problem. But it's really the dysregulation that leads to disease risk. So being able to regulate the stress response is a great thing. Having a robust reaction to something that helps you kind of rally the troops is exactly an adaptive response that aids survival. When we experience frequent false alarms or stress is just not turning off, that's when we see the problematic reactions to our body. So many of you have probably heard of cortisol. It's often referred to as the stress hormone. Years ago, there were late night infomercials about Cortislim and all kinds of products geared towards reducing cortisol. Those always make me laugh because cortisol is a really essential part of our survival. It helps us drive our daily circadian rhythms. It helps us meet our metabolic needs. If we need to increase, the available glucose in our bloodstream, cortisol is there to help us do that. So it's really important to note that, this incredible cascade of hormones that results in cortisol is not the enemy, and that instead it's actually empowering us to live fully. When we see a stressor in our environment, our brain detects that stressor and signals alarm to our hypothalamus, which is inside the brain. And it really starts this hormone cascade that activates its neighbor that sits just outside the blood-brain barrier, the pituitary gland, which then sends another signal through the bloodstream that reaches the kidneys just above them, the adrenal glands. And there, the cortex of the adrenal glands, which is how cortisol gets its name, leads to the secretion of cortisol. And that cortisol helps us make a lot of energy available so that we can meet those metabolic needs, those costly things like outrunning a predator. It might be a good time to return to what you wrote. Did you think stress was good for you? Now that we're hearing this, hopefully I'm changing your mind. For a long time, we have learned that being activated absolutely supports optimal performance and optimal arousal levels. It's aversive to be bored. We don't like it. If anyone who has a tween like I do knows that "Mom, I'm bored" is probably the last thing you actually want to hear. We thrive when stress is at the right level. And what do I mean by that? When it's overwhelming, when it's extreme, then it causes anxiety and alarm and maybe, impairment. So being able to kind of tone stress down when it's too elevated or lean into it when it's not elevated enough to help your performance is really important. So getting kind of in the practice of getting good at stress is something I'd love for us to think more about. Kelly McGonigal has a great TED Talk about this very thing. And I think, some interesting findings that go along with this are that when folks experienced more stress, but they believed that stress was harmful, they ended up having worse health outcomes and survival rates. Counter to that, when folks believed that their stress was not harmful to their health, they actually had better health and survival rates. So just the idea of our attitudes and our cognitions about stress and about the events in our lives actually mattering to our stress and our health, I think changes how us as educators go forward sharing the message of what to do about stress and big feelings. So we can change our stress mindset, and that's a really important step forward for us as researchers, is thinking about, stress is my body rising to the occasion, seeing stress as a challenge, not a threat bearing down on us. And now we can kind of puzzle piece all this together and thinking about if our thoughts affect how we experience stress, what are the steps in that? So in looking at this diagram, I think it's a kind of a ton of information and a beautiful snapshot. But first, you can think about our outside environment. Some things maybe don't even make it past our perceptual filter at the person level. We sometimes don't even notice maybe we've been insulted, right? Or maybe there are things that could have been stressors but weren't because we just didn't even notice. But once we have noticed, we're going to make an appraisal about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or irrelevant to us. And we can think further about whether or not it's a threat. Is this an immediate danger or a threat to me? Is this a challenge? Is this something I kind of have to just, boy, this is going to take a lot of energy and focus. I need to rise up to meet this occasion? Or is it even potentially rewarding? So that first primary appraisal that we make can dictate how stressful something feels to us. Secondarily, if we do identify it as something that's threatening or challenging, then do we have adequate resources to respond to that? You can imagine that if you thought something was an immediate threat and you had virtually no resources to respond to it, that would present a worst case scenario for stress. Whereas looking for opportunities and challenge, seeing something not as a threat, and then also expanding our capacity to meet challenges with more resources can absolutely have the impact of helping us respond better to stress. So now I think a great way to kind of build this out one step further is to think about what the science of emotion tells us about how we can change the emotions that we feel. So we've talked about stress and stress coping. Now let's put it all together with what we can do to change those big feelings that we have when we have them. So James Gross has been, studying emotion regulation forever, and he, I think, has a great way of describing it. He says it's the process by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, how they experience and express those emotions. And he developed a model that helps us think about, when you are feeling like you just want to have a good cry, you might choose a situation where it elicits that. You're going to listen to Taylor Swift's new breakup song? Well, get ready to cry. Or maybe you want to turn your attention towards something, help you, maximize your appreciation of something. Maybe gratitude helps us turn our attention towards aspects of a situation that we really want to hone in on to have the type of emotional reaction we want. Further, cognitive change, which we'll talk a lot more about in a moment, is something where we can challenge ourselves to think differently about a situation to change how we end up feeling about it. And then finally, once the train's already left the station and we're already having a response, we can try to modify that response by, let's say we got a gift that we don't particularly love, but we want to be polite. We might say, I love it, right? Let's see how believable you can be. But there also might be times where you're really upset about something, but it doesn't feel like it's the right moment or a safe moment to maybe express that. So we might suppress those emotions. So what does that get us? Well, it turns out that cognitive reappraisal is a really great strategy because oftentimes we don't really get to choose the situations that we're in. But what happens if we need to regulate our emotions when we can't really choose what to attend to or how to be in a situation that gets us feeling the way we want? We can change our thoughts to alter the type of emotional reaction we have to it. And it turns out that people who are especially skilled at cognitive reappraisal end up having improved social relationships, more adaptive and more positive coping, and experience more positive emotion. And it turns out that neuroscience has lent a lot of understanding of the mechanism behind why this is so successful. It turns out that it's a lot more effective than trying to suppress an emotion that you are already having. So trying to continue to think differently about something helps us expand our prefrontal cortex ability to inhibit our behavior and our actions. And it also helps reduce the threat signal that our amygdala is sending to our prefrontal cortex. So in other words, it's making it easier for the brain to kind of overcome the feeling of being in danger or being under threat. Suppression, you're still getting that strong signal from the amygdala, but your prefrontal cortex is working overtime to try to cover up for that and to keep you from acting on really strong impulses. So you can see that that's kind of a bit of a math problem. It's not panning out. So your body is actually having a worse response, even if you're trying really hard to keep a brave face. So now it's time to apply some of this. So based on what we've talked about so far, I would love to invite you to think about a silver lining that you've discovered when you had a failure or a setback or some challenge in life. Was there a silver lining that ended up kind of becoming obvious to you maybe later that you can use to think about how to think of multiple perspectives as you experience stress or big emotions that you're not sure how to deal with? We encourage folks to just observe and identify the emotions that they're having, just putting words to, I'm feeling really upset by this. I'm feeling really, afraid about this. That can be really powerful. And then once we've kind of noticed that we're having that, then we think about, okay, what thoughts am I having that are leading to that fear, right? Well, I'm afraid that I won't succeed and it's making me really scared. I'm worried I'll fall flat on my face. Well, those thoughts aren't facts. They're just reactions that we're having. So we might want to reality check ourselves and just ask, what are some other ways to see this? Is there another view? So I want to encourage you to take a moment and just jot down a reminder to yourself. What's one time where you discovered a silver lining, some benefit that came out of a setback? And just remind yourself of that here. And as you do that, I want to encourage you to think about the way in which growth and flourishing are actually not just possible, but can likely happen even in the wake of stress. We can encourage growth and flourishing in the wake of stress by just, even in the darkest times, intentionally creating positive events and moments for ourselves. And that can be something as simple as going outside and just saying, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to watch the sunset. Or I'm going to go outside and see how many stars I can find. Whatever it is, or where's the moon and what is it looking like tonight? You can find some way to just intentionally create positive moments, even in suffering. And, there's research from Susan Folkman and her colleagues that tells us that even humor at times of, intense suffering during loss can help us ease our suffering. And that feels awkward to think that humor during dark times would be something you might go to, but obviously choose wisely. That would be with people who are close with you and understand the nature of that humor. And then finding ways to continue to have moments of positive emotion can help improve your problem solving. So if you're stuck on something, taking that intentional break, refreshing yourself can actually help you broaden and build and make better solutions. So if you're a student or if you're someone who has to do some big creative project, taking breaks is essential for improving your thinking. And so some basic kind of tips about how to cope well with stress is if you can change the nature of the stressor, it will reduce the impact of it. So if we don't like the situation, can we affect it? That's called problem-focused coping. But a lot of times we actually can't, right? There are times when we don't have control over a situation. And that's where we lean on those emotion-focused coping techniques, where we think about emotion regulation and we think about expanding our capacity to endure stress with some of the techniques we've talked about. Another big finding that's come out of the coping literature is really that when we avoid things, it's not exactly a recipe for success. So proactive coping that goes toward the events, either anticipating that something is coming down the pipe and you want to be ready and expand your, rest more in anticipation of having the need of more bandwidth. Just kind of giving yourself grace and recognizing when you'll need to be proactively prepared for stress, but then also, not avoiding it. Substance use and other types of avoidance is related to really maladaptive outcomes. So proactive problem-focused coping is really beneficial if control is possible, but sometimes it's not, which leads us to thinking about what are some foolproof ways that we can cope with stress regardless of the situation. Social support is one of the most widely supported strategies and tools for buffering stress. How can we kind of help ourselves be protected and prepare regardless of if stress is happening or if we anticipate it? Shelley Taylor and her colleagues define social support as information from others that one is valued, is loved, is cared for, esteemed, and part of a network. And it's important to remember that we're social animals at heart. So we rely on relationships with each other to live well. Feelings of social connectedness, of not being isolated, are powerfully protective features for helping us respond adaptively with stress and live a healthy life. So I'll turn our attention now to thinking about how to expand your coping toolkit. There's a nice menu here, and this is only a small selection of many different ways that you can expand your coping toolkit. Maybe some of these look really familiar to you and you're a rock star at them, but maybe some aren't as familiar to you, and you might think about ways that you can continue being a good friend to yourself by expanding your toolkit. So research definitely highlights the essential importance of exercise in regulating our moods and emotions, as well as our metabolic and circadian rhythms. Exercise can give us that dose of endogenous opioids or endorphins that make us feel good, so they can provide a momentary relief, but they also set us up to sleep better. And it turns out that sleep is a really essential part of an emotion regulation strategy. So telling undergrads to sleep is one of my favorite things to do. They also laugh at me. But it's important to note that improving your sleep hygiene, having better sleep habits will pay off. When we sleep, we take the emotional sting out of the experiences we had that day, and we actually enhance our ability to recall and remember those things. So if you're a learner, sleep is essential for learning. If you're a human being who has feelings, sleep is essential for basically creating a sense of overnight therapy, so to speak. And social connectedness, social support, as we talked about, are just part of who we are because we are social creatures. We talked about cognitive reframing or restructuring or reappraisal as strategies that you can use. So looking for more opportunities to see the challenge instead of the threat, or the silver lining or the benefit finding that you can do in thinking about the experiences that you're facing or challenged by. We started with a gratitude reflection and thinking about the way in which gratitude acts as a really important tool for building those social connections is something that researchers have really been expanding on in positive psychology over the last many years. Expressive writing, being able to just kind of get your thoughts onto the page and make sense of them, create a narrative or a story around experiences that are tough that you're having, can help you process them. And then giving ourselves empathy, other people empathy, feeling their pain and appreciating that sounds really hard for you. I'm sorry you're dealing with that. I'm here for you. But also extending that same compassion to ourselves. So can we say, I'm going to talk to myself the way a trusted or dear friend would hear from me, right? Can I talk to myself at least as kindly as I would talk to a dear friend? We can use relaxation techniques, including mindfulness and other types of breathing, to help us lean in during those tough moments and expand our capacity to deal with them. So I think this is a good time to give one of those a try. So I'll share a brief definition about what mindfulness meditation is, but then we're going to get to practice it. So Kelly McGonigal said that meditation is not about getting rid of all of your thoughts. It's learning not to get so lost in them that you forget what your goal is. Don't worry if your focus isn't perfect when meditating. Just practice coming back to the breath again and again. And basically, this is an exercise in acceptance that we're going to try without judgment to just notice, to imagine our thoughts as clouds passing in the distance and give ourselves some space from those thoughts, remembering that thoughts are thoughts, not facts. They're experiences we're having, but we can just try to notice them and then keep breathing through it. So we're going to give that a try. If you don't mind, I invite you to put one hand on your chest, the other hand on your belly, and just kind of maybe close your eyes and listen to my voice and just settle into your breath. So just taking a moment to breathe and notice which hand is moving. Let's try to just take a few breaths. Notice your body in the chair. Notice your breath filling your lungs, expanding and releasing. And now make an effort to breathe deeply by relaxing your belly and letting it distend a bit. So really trying to breathe in and move that belly hand, less so moving the hand on your chest. Really filling your lungs with more air, maybe taking more sips of air. Holding for just a moment. And then releasing your air like you're blowing out through a straw. And I invite you to try about 5 or so of these deep, relaxed breaths that feel like they're going all the way to the deepest part of your belly. And as you're noticing your breath, you might even try saying to yourself, I am, as you're breathing in. And a word like calm as you're breathing out, or loved, or powerful, or whatever it is you need to hear in this moment. Maybe take one more nice deep breath and kind of shake your shoulders out, bring yourself back to the present moment. Ugh. So what we've just done is told our brain that because of our breath, our parasympathetic nervous system is now activating, and it's telling our brain, we're calm, there's no threat, we're okay. So we can actually change our thinking through our breathing. So if we're having trouble changing our thoughts by changing our thoughts, just go back to the breath. Just notice your thoughts. Say, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I'm going to just notice my breathing. There's a lot of different meditative experiences that you can have. You can try body scans. There's so many great resources on YouTube or on our CMHC, Counseling and Mental Health Center website. I want to encourage you to check those out. A couple of them are listed here. So the final kind of piece of the puzzle that I think brings all of this together is from positive psychology's tackling of how to build a meaningful life. So positive psychology, as Marty Seligman writes, takes you through the countryside of pleasure and gratification up into the high country of strength and virtue, and finally to the peaks of lasting fulfillment, which are meaning and purpose. So the pleasant life is really about just noticing. There's joy that is there for us to savor in our world. Even during tough times, the sun still rises, right? There are still times when maybe you're enjoying a meal, but you're busy looking on your phone, distracted by email. Maybe set your phone down and just allow yourself to savor. Just smell the wonderful smell of your delicious meal. I'm getting hungry. Just in noticing and enhancing and savoring those momentary moments of pleasure. You can practice looking closely at something for the details, or having a mindful walk, or experiencing the awe of nature. Another kind of deepening element of this practice is the good life. And that's where we actually use our stress and we use our engagement to get in the zone. And that really means, meeting our skill level with a challenge. So if we're very skilled, we're going to need something pretty challenging to let time just kind of stop for us and to really get deep engagement going in a way that feels so good. Think about a time when you lost track of time and you realize, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for 3 hours, reading this book or playing this instrument or playing this game or whatever it is, or spending time with somebody. Time just stops for you. We love those deep, engaging experiences, but they're not without challenge, right? We want to meet our skill level with a big challenge, wherever that is. And finally, that path to the enduring, abiding, longest lasting source of happiness that comes to us is through connection with others. So serving people through altruistic acts or connecting with people in our lives produces the greatest sense of meaning and purpose. Maybe through the type of work or social life that we have, maybe through volunteer service or through connecting deeply with something that feels bigger than ourselves. Some people experience that through religion, other people experience it through nature or other types of paths. But circling back to where we began today with gratitude, gratitude acts as the social glue that helps us notice and find those things that we can hold on to even in tough times to extend our gratitude for. We can remind ourselves of them and we can remind other people. And that seeks to bind us together. When we say, I'm really grateful for you in my life, boy, that relationship gets supercharged. So to put it all together, where we've been today, stress and emotions help us build meaning in our lives. They themselves are not the enemy at all, but in fact are adaptive and they aid our survival in meaningful ways that have led them to exist. They're tuned for our survival. They do powerfully inform us, right? When we have big feelings about something, we think, gosh, I don't know if that's the right decision for me. I don't feel so good about that. Or I really want to pursue this. It makes me feel so good when I'm around these people. That activates us and helps us build that deep engagement that we talked about for the good life. We guide ourselves toward enhancing social bonds, and it ultimately is the path to the most long-lasting source of happiness, that connectedness with others. When we regulate our emotions well and we develop well-being, it doesn't mean that we're happy all the time. And I love sharing this message with our undergrad and grad students that, competitive busyness and competitive happiness won't win us anything in terms of a meaningful life. But instead, accepting that negative emotions are important too, and they powerfully help inform us about how to live. And that distress is one form of stress, but also so is eustress, which is the good kind of stress. So we have a lot to learn from experiences of negative emotion like fear or anger. In fact, researchers have recently discovered that anger drives us towards our important goals just the way that happiness does. When we get frustrated about something, it activates us. So notice if your emotions are not serving you well, if they don't feel adaptive, and know that support is available and that these techniques and many others like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy are very empirically grounded techniques that can help anyone have a better relationship with their emotions and their stress. So in closing, I want to encourage us to draw on the power of emotions and stress as we go after the deep goals and connection and engagement that helps us build meaningful lives.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you for leading us through the guided meditation as well. That was wonderful. I feel so much better now. So it's great.
Yay.
Yeah. We are waiting for a couple of questions to come through. So if you guys have questions, just please put those in the QA. But I'll start us off with something that probably occurs to all of us. We're like, okay, we've just learned some really good techniques to manage our stress. But what if you're in a situation where those techniques aren't serving you and you really feel like you can't change something? What's the best strategy there?
Yeah, I think, like we just talked about, and we've got some support resources that Roxanne is sharing in the chat. If you feel like your emotions are actually controlling you instead of you being able to regulate them, reaching out for support is so important. Clinical psychologists and many other helping professionals are extremely well versed in empirically and scientifically grounded ways of improving and enhancing our relationship with stress and emotion. So I think that's the most important thing. Um, we talked a little bit about a nice long menu of things that can be in your toolkit. So I think, another possible thing to think about that I'll share is, sleep. Sleep is such a critical tool for us. Some pro tips that I can help you, share. Exercise in the morning, and you'll sleep better, not just that night, but probably the night after as well. When we have that morning exercise, it helps dial in our cortisol circadian rhythm, helps us be active and alert when we need it, and then to calm down in time for bed. If you're ruminating, if you're thinking a lot about stress and anxiety and worries when you're trying to go to bed and you're just struggling to sleep, keeping a notepad at your bedside and just saying like, okay, there's that thought again. I'm going to park that on this post-it note and just set that on my nightstand. And that reminder about work or that fear that I'll forget something, it's not going to happen because I've parked it on my sticky note. And then you can tell yourself, right now it's time for rest and I have a place for that thought. And then, believe it or not, the exercise we just did can help you sleep better. So if you're ruminating, jot down the thought, but then now I dare you to stay awake after breathing for 5 minutes in a cool, dark room with a fan going that's quiet. Um, and really getting that deep breath, because now you're going to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, help that stress response say, okay, we're all set. We don't need to be active now, and really dialing it in. We want to ramp up stress when we're getting ready for a big ask, but now sleep, not the time for that ramped up stress. It's time to be able to dial that back. So I think coping and emotion regulation are things that we can build as a practice, as a bigger kind of style of life where we recognize that stress isn't the enemy, but it's really tuning our response to stress and tuning our response to difficult emotions to draw out the pluses and to basically be able to kind of work around those risks or disadvantages.
Okay. We've got two questions that are very similar, so I'm going to combine them. You had
Okay.
mentioned the website in your presentation, and some of our guests want to know what that website is. And they also
Awesome. Yeah.
yeah, they wanted to know
So
what the name of the center at UT that you mentioned as well, that had lots of resources.
yes, thank you so much for that. So the Counseling and Mental Health Center on campus is really important. They even have an app called Thrive that you can go into the Google Store or the Apple Store and download. I would strongly encourage you to do that. And a big shout out to all my friends at CMHC and the Longhorn Wellness Center. So many great partners working across campus to get these messages out to our UT community. So definitely go and download the Thrive app. It has tools on things like mindfulness and sleep and emotion regulation. A lot of the things we talk about today, there are strategies that app can help you practice, gratitude being one of them as well. We have a lot of great resources. So Counseling and Mental Health Center, cmhc.utexas.edu is a great place to go. There's awesome resources like a coping, a mind-body lab coping webpage where you can go on a guided meditation cruise or a starry night sky meditation. So they're guided imagery where you close your eyes and you let the voice just kind of help you create this beautiful picture in your mind of going on a restful cruise and going to a grotto that has this peaceful waterfall. I mean, who wouldn't want that as a refreshing break? So I think that gets at this other point that I hoped to be able to share with folks today, is that we often treat people in our lives a lot better than we treat ourselves. That if somebody came to us and said, I'm really struggling, that you would listen. You would say, I'm really sorry that you're experiencing that. And so can we extend ourselves the same compassion and kindness that we would extend to a dear friend? So try talking to yourself in those tough moments as if you're your own dearest friend. it's hard to feel like we're not good enough, or it's hard to feel like we've failed. And that failing or not feeling good enough is something that's a shared human experience, right? That we're not perfect and that we're all bound together in our shared imperfection and an imperfect world. And then that's where that mindfulness that we kind of started practicing a bit today can come in really handy, is just noticing what are the feelings I'm having and just acknowledge and validate that they are happening. Those feelings are happening. And just accept that, I won't always feel amazing. I won't always feel bursting with joy. And that's also okay. That's part of being a human being, and that I'm not alone in my suffering. Other people also suffer. Other people also fail and struggle. And that's part of this imperfect life that we live. And so giving ourselves this extension of care and treating ourselves and talking with ourselves in the way that we would with a dear friend is linked to way better outcomes in terms of our self-worth, our feelings of well-being, our life satisfaction, relationship satisfaction. Who doesn't want to feel less perfectionistic, right? And I think it's important to note, sometimes people criticize mindfulness or other types of techniques as being indulgent, right? Or narcissistic, like that you'll be so caught up in your own little world because you're being so mindful of yourself. And in fact, that's not true. That honing into self-compassion is reminding us that we're not the only ones who suffer. So by the nature of it, it isn't a narcissistic practice.
Yeah. We do have a couple of questions about the difference between anxiety and stress.
Yeah,
Yeah, so kind of talk about the difference between those. And then
yeah,
one case in particular is, they're mentioning that their daughter has habitual anxiety about going to sleep. So,
yeah,
what would be a good second choice? If you're not asleep after 20 minutes, is it get out of
yeah,
bed? Is it doing an
yeah.
activity? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I think, that's a situation. So I'll start with the bigger picture question and then drill down to the more specific. So the difference between stress and anxiety is really, stress is something that's happening as a reaction that's, presumably something that's acute, that's short-lived. When it doesn't turn off, when it becomes chronic and unremitting, is when it can lead to experiences like anxiety. Mood disorders and anxiety disorders are risk factors that come from maladaptive coping or ineffective coping with stress. And so working with someone who can help, give folks the tools to reflect on starts oftentimes with self-monitoring. So noticing what are the thoughts I'm having that are leading me to feel very worried and feel this kind of intense level of worry or impairment from my worry. How is it limiting me? And then, recognizing that those thoughts are changeable. So that's what cognitive behavioral therapy really seeks to do and is very effective for depression and anxiety, among lots of other, multi-component treatments. This is just one method, but there are many other methods that can complement CBT. But it seeks to help people gain insights and change their thoughts so that they can separate and give some distance from their feelings. That, as we talked about, when we change our thoughts, we change the emotions that we have as a result of that. So that relationship is something that therapists are very, very skilled at being able to help unpack and explore with clients.
Hey, I think we've got to all the questions. So thank you very much, Dr. Evans, for speaking with us today. That was really fascinating. Love the meditation. Really appreciate you. So thank you very much again.
Thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. As you guys know, you can register for the next virtual lunchtime lecture on our website, texasexes.org, and the title of the May one is going to be What You Can Do to Prevent Cancer or Find It Early. That's going to be on May 1st, which is a Wednesday. And again, just go to texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. Thanks, y'all. Y'all have a good week.